Humanist Heathenry. So humanism is often conflated with atheism because a lot of atheists that are trying to find some kind of ideology to find meaning in their lives look toward humanism or naturalism. Humanism is not religious and it does not make you an atheist. In fact, my ordination comes from spiritual humanism. And it's been a while, but I believe one of their requirements is actually believing in something spiritual. To explain humanism, we'll look at the history of humanism first. It's actually kind of interesting because a lot of people that are anti-atheist tend to be kind of anti-humanist simply because they have a bias toward atheism. But again, the two are not actually related. It's just that a lot of atheists tend to gravitate toward humanism because they're trying to believe in something and they're human. So, you may not necessarily be able to have faith in something that you can't prove, but you are human, so you can have faith in humanity. That's kind of the idea there. So I'm going to read from the Encyclopedia Britannica. It's also important to note here that language is not prescriptive, it is descriptive. A lot of us end up using language in a means that is prescriptive. Like if we see, like grammar Nazis, right? Famous for, being like, that word means this. Well, colloquially, the common culture says certain words change from certain things. The word gay, for example, is actually a pretty interesting history of it meaning non-conforming to society, and that's why it's attributed to happiness. And that's why you get a lot of boomers that are like, they took the word gay away from us, when in reality, the word gay has always meant non-conforming to society. And maybe you can kind of draw your own lines there. So you see, language changes with time. So when humanism, as we understand it today, had been created, it was not actually named humanism, but rather has, by historians, been attributed to humanism. So the Encyclopedia Britannica, the history of the term humanism is complex but enlightening. It was first employed as Humanismus by 19th century German scholars to designate the Renaissance emphasis on classical studies and education. These studies were pursued and endorsed by educators known as early as the 15th century as Humanisti, that is, professors or students of classical literature. The word Humanisti derives from the Studia Humanitatis, a course of classical studies that in the early 15th century consisted of grammar, poetry, rhetoric, history, and moral philosophy. The Studia Humanitatis were held to be equivalent of the Greek paideia. Their name was itself based on the Roman statesman Marcus Tullius Cicero's concept of humanitas, an educational and political ideal that was the intellectual basis of the entire movement. Renaissance humanism, in all its forms, defined itself in its straining towards this ideal. No discussion of humanism, therefore, can validity without an understanding of humanitas. So we see the Renaissance really comes from humanism. And then further on, the Enlightenment and classical liberalism, which many libertarians identify with today, all come from humanism, the idea of humanism. So essentially what had happened, and you kind of see that there, was a lot of students around the beginning of the Renaissance, they had become disenfranchised with the God-centric morality of Christianity. So humanism is not a Christian ideal. It actually comes from quite the opposite. It comes from people seeing a need for more of a human-centered morality system. And you'll notice that's kind of a theme of this video. So harvard.edu has a little bit that's kind of more interesting in that it kind of defines human-centered ideologies. So I'll read the top paragraph there. And of course, these will be linked in the description as per usual. Please read them at your leisure. They're pretty interesting. So, history of humanism. Human-centered ideologies have been popular among various philosophers and religious leaders since at least 1500 BCE. While humanists today might credit any number of these figures as a contributor to contemporary humanist thought, no one proto-humanist philosopher is seen as the creator of humanism. Instead, many humanists point to the ubiquity of humanist ideologies across time and place as a sign that such a system of looking at the world is natural, rational, and self-evident. So you'll see there that this is just a common theme in history. It makes sense, being human, that we do not necessarily understand the divine. We don't even know if it necessarily exists. As I've said in previous videos, I separate my emotional, spiritual beliefs with my logical, practical beliefs. And that's kind of where humanism comes in, as it's really just human-centered morality. In a heathen sense, we can call this Midgard-centered morality. I don't know what the gods want. I can do ritual, I can do offerings, I can meditate, I can feel the gods, I can feel the Landvitir, I can feel the spirits. But at the end of the day, I don't know if that is my emotion. I don't know if that's delusion necessarily. All I know is that that is a feeling. That is emotional content.
Emotional content.
That's where I will bring up another term which I find very interesting: agnosticism. Not agnosticism, but agnosticism. So agnosticism is simply lacking knowledge. Like, we're all agnostic to a certain degree. That's agnostic, Gnostic coming from the Greek gnosis, whereas agnostic is literally ignorant and Gnostic combined, agnostic. And that is, I don't know what the gods are. I don't know how to even define the word God necessarily. You know, we kind of see it, the definition of God as maybe a supreme being, maybe it's a spiritual force, maybe it's a literal being that is very powerful and maybe a primordial being. I don't know. There's so much that could be possible that when I live my life, I don't live it as though there were some kind of large figure watching me, threatening to spank me if I do something wrong, right? Which is more of a Christian definition than a heathen definition, but you kind of get the idea. So agnosticism, being an agnostic heathen, I still give worth to the gods. I still do things to honor them. Remember from previous videos, I've said this multiple times, worship comes from to give worth. It comes from Old English. But I would be the same exact person I am now, whether they're real or not. I am not beholden to them. Just as if they do exist in any way, shape, or form, they are not beholden to me. And that's one of the reasons that I separate belief into emotional and logical, into the esoteric, that hidden knowledge, that's spiritual, and the mundane. And I think you'll find that if you look at our ancestors, the Norse, the arch-heathens, the pre-Christian Norse and Germanic peoples, you will notice that they also are very practical people. So this really is a very heathen way of going about things. And I recently wrote an article on a website I found called medium.com. Apparently they let you just kind of post articles, so I'll probably post a lot in there, but I'll post the article down below of different views of heathenry and paganism in general, because I found some interesting things. One of the goals and benefits to humanism is that in-group, out-group mentality. Is we're trying to use it in a positive way. So, and I've mentioned this in previous videos again, I have gone through certain things in life, and other people have gone through same, if not similar things. So I am able to empathize and know at least some of the pains that person's going through. I've heard an argument against that humanist thought that I cannot relate to certain problems that certain people go through, like more specificity, or somebody that might have grown up looking different than me, maybe they're a different gender, whatever, different walks of life, different classes. That's not a very good argument, simply because that can happen to me. I can understand what somebody else is going through. I mean, that's just human empathy. That's how that works. Like, I believe, oh my God, I think it was like one of my first like 4 or 5 videos where I mentioned mirror neurons. So we have these things in our brains called mirror neurons, and the theory behind them, we don't fully understand, but the theory behind them is that we see something happening to somebody and we can kind of feel that happening to us. Obviously, there's certain people with certain brain chemistry, like psychopathy and sociopathy, that don't fully get that because the serotonin in their brain doesn't work properly. But for the average person, that's why we empathize with other people. The way they initially found mirror neurons was because they had hooked up, I believe it was a chimpanzee, something to his head that scanned his synapses when they would fire. And the same synapses would fire when they saw something as when they would do something. So the idea is that when you see somebody go through something, you're also able to put yourself in their shoes. So one of the aims of humanism is to utilize that ability to empathize, to create this cohesion between people. And actually, if you look at both the BITE model and ISCA being the organization that they actually use in court systems to prove that something is a cult, and then the BITE model is just a more simplified version that allows us to kind of measure if certain organizations are cults or not. And one of the things that both BITE and ISCA agree upon is in-group, out-group mentality. Cults will thrive on separation of people, creating an us versus them. You see that in a lot of like political ideologies as well. So humanism in a lot of ways also fights that extremism that we often see in a lot of different religions and ideologies. And through humanism, through that Midgard-centered morality, we are redirecting human nature. And I brought that up in my Othr video, is the idea that so we can't repress things. I've talked a little bit about shadow. I'm planning on doing a full video on shadow archetypes. Obviously, since the move, it's been a little difficult to film. But that shadow is a lot of your repressed things, right? Like one that I brought up a few times is in Christianity, they often repress a lot of their sexual urges, and then you get priests, pastors, people in authority that abuse people in sexual ways or have other abusive behaviors, and it's because they've had to, through their ideology, repress those certain emotions. So rather than find a healthier route for it, which is the redirection that I'm talking about, they repress it, and it festers. If you don't work with your shadow, it festers. And again, to come back to a human-centered ideology rather than a God or gods-centered ideology, morality. So to come back to Midgard-centered morality as opposed to Asgard or Vanaheim or Jotunheim-centered religion-centered morality, good and evil are relative. Something that's bad to me may not necessarily be bad to you. The analogy that I like to use a lot, mostly because I have a bias towards wolves, if you can't tell, for a wolf, starving is evil. Obviously, a wolf wants to feed their pups. They want to, provide for their family. Typically, a pack unit is a family. But to the sheep, being eaten is evil. They prefer safety. They prefer, being in that herd and not having to deal with wolves eating them. So you see the moral relativism there and how good and evil are very, very subjective. Well, for a human being, certain things are positive and certain things are negative. It benefits me to make my environment better. It benefits me to make my friends and family, neighbors, coworkers, happy, and to make them content, at the very least, with my behavior and what I provide for them, because that benefits me. And it comes back to you are, and this is the video that I actually mentioned the neurons, and you are a selfish protagonist of your own story. You are the center of your own story, and you first and foremost care about the self. I've mentioned Robert Sapolsky before. He's a professor from Stanford, teaches about brain chemistry, stuff like that. One of the things he has mentioned is that we also have an inclination to protect our genes. So, obviously we protect our children, and then we protect cousins a little bit less. And there's actually really interesting science behind that. We are hardwired to protect ourselves and to protect our genes and to protect that in-group. So why not extend that to cohesion? Actually came across another article on that medium. I'll see if I can find it, and I'll put it in the description if I can. It was talking about Nietzsche and an interesting growth into what he could call Übermensch, the Overman. So there's a lot of politicizing around his philosophy, he did die in an asylum, so take what he says with a grain of salt. But he had an interesting analogy for people, and thus spoke Zarathustra, which is a sort of a novelized version of his philosophy, where a wise man of the mountain kind of comes down and tries to integrate with society, and people ignore him and like the wisdom that he has to give. So obviously Nietzsche's projecting there a little bit, and he had this idea of what would create the Übermensch. And that was that, we all start as cow first. So I think he called the city Motley Cow, because which is an ode to, I believe, Plato. It was the idea of herd mentality. Cows are kind of dumb; they just sort of go along with the herd, that sort of thing. And then you have the step above that would be the camel. So the camel is a pack animal. So the camel is a beast of burden, and they will often bear a load. So they're above the cow in the sense that they realize they need to kind of up their game a little bit, but they still feel the load, so to speak. And then the third step is the lion. So the camel grows out of that and becomes a lion, and the lion wants to gain his independence and his because he's this ferocious creature that is now wandering the desert trying to command himself, right, to fully be this realized Übermensch. And that's where my idea of it kind of differs. I think he chose the lion because it tends to be a bit more of lions aren't necessarily solitary hunters, but big cats kind of tend to be. And I think that was sort of his thought behind that. And again, I love Wulf analogies, and I've used the pack thing before, but I think that is a better step, because a pack works cohesively. Like I said, it's a family unit. The kindred is a family unit. When done properly, your hearth, your kindred, and I'll go over how to kind of build that and some of the other things in future things. Also link my video about the kindred that I was in, why to be in a kindred. I'll link that below. There's a lot more benefit in being part of a pack, part of that cohesive unit. And I think that's what we have in humanism over more independent ideologies. That's not to say that having individual strength isn't good, because being a strong individual means that you will make a strong team, a strong pack, a strong kindred. That's about it. So really, like I said, it's just human-centered morality. You're just coming from the position of what benefits me, and more importantly, how that helps others. Because if you help others, you in turn are helping yourself. If you work toward a more positive society, then that society is better, and guess what? You're living in that society. You will benefit. The only problem is you get people that are selfish in the wrong way. So you get people that are selfish in the sense that they, hoard toilet paper. Or try to upsell hand sanitizer for like 1,000% of what they bought it for. Those behaviors, and a lot of the behaviors that we're seeing with the quarantine, because as I'm filming this, it's the COVID-19 quarantine of 2020. If you're watching this from the far future, where hopefully humanity is not beyond Thunderdome, but we'll see. I mean, currently during this crisis, you have a lot of people that are actually working together. People as a species like to cooperate. We are a pack species. We do have that pack mentality. And I kind of mentioned this actually in that Selfish Protagonist video, because there is a positive way to be selfish. I mean, at the end of the day, you want to have the best life for yourself. You want to reduce suffering as much as possible. You know, that's that id part of yourself. But your superego that keeps the id in check needs to direct that id. The logical side needs to direct the emotional side. Just as with my spiritual beliefs, my logical side directs my spiritual side, my emotional wants. And for the new Kindred that I'm starting here in Texas, I always start by creating like a Facebook page. It's an easy place to have people go, messages, whatnot. So I have one specifically for the Desert Wolf Kindred, which I'll go over specificity on that in future videos. But I have another one where I'm going to organize moots and all that. That is called Humanist Heathenry Central Texas. And I'm trying to set the precedent of humanism. But just like the old Kindred, you know, multiple paths are welcome. You know, it doesn't matter if you're an eclectic pagan, if you're Wiccan. We had one guy who was actually very integral to starting the Skilder Kindred that was more of an eclectic pagan. Like, he had felt a draw to the Norse gods at the time. He actually had a vision with Odin, and that in turn actually led to the creation of the Skilder Kindred. I was hoping to interview him before I moved. I might reach out to him and maybe do a Skype interview, something like that, but hopefully. That's the precedent that I'm setting for this new Kindred that I'm starting. And I'll go over starting a Kindred in future videos. Might be the next couple of them. There's so many that I want to knock out. I don't have a whole lot of time during the day that I can actually film. I think I'm filming this at almost 3 in the morning right now. So, standard into the video type stuff. Like, comment, subscribe, do the thing. If you disagree, please comment. I assume that if you're watching up to this point, you care a little bit more about my videos. So, small update. It's been hard to film, as I mentioned. As you can see, this is some of the boxes that we moved with. I'm currently sitting in the garage. And it is kind of difficult to film with multiple people in the house. Nothing against them. I just need to take the time and make the space and maybe kill a little bit of sleep so I can provide you guys content. And that's on me. So, as per usual, all my links in the description below. I will add my Medium link on top of in my links, on top of having just that article in there. It's going to be a lot easier for me to spit out those articles than it's going to be to film this, because I can just type that out. I don't have to go through the editing process, which takes forever. Like over a half an hour, 45 minutes I think on this right now. So yeah, with all that, be better tomorrow than you were yesterday. We are the sum of our actions. Skull!